Miracles, Part 5. We've been discussing the book Miracles by Eric Metaxas, and this time we're going to come down to modern miracles, and there's a little introduction before we get started. The miracle stories, and the introduction starts out. In his book Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis rather famously said that when it came to deciding who Jesus Christ was, we really only had three choices. First, we could say he was a liar and all the things he said were simply lies. Second, we could say he was not a liar but a lunatic, so he couldn't be held responsible for saying the things he said, but presumably, of course, they were false. And third, we could say he was actually who he said he was, the Lord of heaven and earth. Lewis said that there were no other options besides those three, Lord, liar, or lunatic, because Jesus hadn't left us any other options. To regard Christ as a wonderful moral teacher is not possible because he said so many things that a sane and wonderful moral teacher would never say, such as when he cursed a fig tree or raised people from the dead or said that he was the promised Messiah of the world, or when he forgave sin or healed the blind, to name a few examples. Socrates didn't do any of these things or claim to do any of those things, but if he had claimed to do, we would rightly say he was an outright liar or a fraud, or simply non compos mentis. And so it must be with Jesus. He can hardly be someone who pronounces deeply sane and wise things on the one hand and a madman or deceiver on the other. We are forced to choose. Lewis here holds our feet to the logical fire. I believe that when it comes to the stories I will tell in the following chapters, this is Eric Metaxas speaking, of course, we are faced with a similar situation. We can perhaps imagine that the people telling these stories are simply lying for purposes of self-aggrandizement or for any other reason. Or we can perhaps imagine that they are simply deceived so that they are themselves convinced that these things happened, although they didn't. Or finally, we can conclude that as difficult as they might be to make sense of, they are nonetheless true stories. The people telling these stories, I am of course one of them, must be carefully considered as either trustworthy witnesses to events or as untrustworthy witnesses to events or non-events. We must consider whether what they are saying is an embellishment in toto or an embellishment in part, or no embellishment at all, but simply factual. We must consider the source, as it were, because in a court of law, as one tries to determine the facts of a case, one has to speak to the reliability of the witnesses. If one has a reliable witness, it's a strong indicator that what the witness is saying actually happened. If one has an unreliable witness, one simply has no way of knowing whether what they are saying happened. And of course, if the witness has reason to prevaricate, then one may suspect that the story is not as advertised. This is why I've chosen to limit myself to telling the stories of people I know personally. This adds a level of trustworthiness to these people because I am not having to take someone else's word for it that they are trustworthy. I've eliminated a layer of confusion. Had I chosen to tell stories of people whom I do not know, I might have found 4 more exotic and incredible miracle stories, but I would not have the satisfaction of knowing that the person telling the story was really and truly trustworthy. So what we have in these pages is limited in scope. Stories told to me by people I know personally, and because I know them personally, stories I believe are true. But I don't believe they are true simply because I trust the people who told them to me. I've been told many stories over the years, but not all of them are true. We have to try to get to the bottom of things that people tell us, and I have tried to include only those stories that I believe withstood my initial skepticism and questions. Just because some miracle stories are true doesn't mean that they all are true. The following stories illustrate that these kinds of experiences are not only for mystics, or only for nuns or monks or priests or certain people. They illustrate that the God of the universe wants to communicate with every single one of us, and that there is not only one way in which he does that. Because he created each of us differently, he will communicate with us individually. Though he is the same God for every one of us, in his tenderness and desire to reach us, he is able to speak to us in ways that are very specific to us. The story of my conversion in the next chapter is a particular illustration of that idea. God will never demand that we speak his language. On the contrary, in love, he condescends to speak ours. He uses visions and dreams and words and circumstances and experiences to communicate with us. And he wants us to expect that. He wants us to expect that, not to demand it, but neither to be closed to it. And now we come to the actual miracle stories. Conversion miracles. It's interesting that he starts with this. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see, John Newton. Christian conversion is a supernatural, radical thing. The heart is changed, and the evidence of it is not just new decisions, but new affections, new feelings. John Piper. The ellipses are his, by the way. I changed. I have been turning into a different person since that half minute. By Joy Davidman. And until you have given up yourself to him, you will not have a real self. Quote from C.S. Lewis. I've often heard people say that the biggest miracle of all is someone's conversion from non-belief to belief, or that the greatest evidence of a miracle is the changed life that results when someone goes from non-belief to belief. But other people are of the mind that people can't change and that we are who we are, and that's that. When somebody claims to have changed, they assume he is probably kidding himself, or more likely trying to fool others. Examples of this view arise when convicted criminals claim to have to come to faith. How convenient for them, the cynics cry, assuming that the actual point of these claims is to persuade the judge or warden or parole board to be lenient with them. We're going to see a counterexample in a minute. This can surely be the case, and yet I can think of several people who really did genuinely come to faith after committing crimes. What shall we make of them? One was my dear friend Chuck Colson. Chuck was the special counsel to Richard Nixon, one of the infamous president's men who took a moral political ambition to new heights and who eventually fell spectacularly in that historical debacle and long national nightmare known as the Watergate scandal. Chuck was called the White House hatchet man and was said to be willing to, quote, run over his grandmother, end quote, to get the president reelected. But just before everything fell apart in public, things were falling apart privately for the former Marine. Something in him began to wonder about God, and in the summer of 1973, over the course of a few weeks, he was dramatically converted. But when word got out that the take-no-prisoners tough guy had become a born-again Christian, the news media had a field day. No one would believe this nasty political operative had really changed his stripes. He was lampooned in political cartoons and on late-night television. But mirabile dictu, it really had happened. In fact, Chuck was so serious about his newfound faith that he refused to take a plea bargain to avoid prison because he would have to lie. His lawyer thought he was out of his mind to refuse it, but Chuck wouldn't back down, and so he went to prison. After he got out of prison, he decided that God wanted him to spend the rest of his life helping prisoners, which he did when he founded Prison Fellowship. Instead of rebooting a very lucrative legal career with big-name clients, he chose to go back into prisons, and that's what he did for the rest of his life. You don't do something like that for 35 years just to fool people into thinking you've changed. But many still doubted he had changed, and even some of his obituaries didn't seem to be able to see the reality of his changed life after all those years. But I knew him personally and saw who he was. His conversion to putting God and others first in his life, to loving his enemies, and to behaving in a way that would glorify God and bless those around him was as deep and authentic as anyone can hope for. Still, the belief that someone is inherently bad and utterly beyond the possibility of change persists. If you've ever met someone who is really awful, or who at least seems pretty awful, you struggle to imagine they could really turn their lives and their sins over to God and be forgiven and changed dramatically. I can see why some thought that about Chuck, and I can think of a few people who fit this bill in my life. I especially remember when I was not yet 15, working for a few hours each Friday and Saturday night as a busboy in a Greek diner near our home. Since I was not yet 16, it was under the table, for tips only, but I needed some cash to buy backpacking equipment, so I'd asked my father if he knew anyone who could use me. He suggested a diner not far from our home. It was owned and run by, no kidding, a corrupt Greek Orthodox priest who had once been our parish priest, but who had been sent packing by the parish council. In later years, I learned from friends that he had chased waitresses, and eventually he went to prison for tax fraud. Who can doubt that he drove people away from God? But as bad as he was, the short order cook in the diner was worse. He was a short, nasty, brutish man, a Greek named Manolis, who every time I entered the kitchen with my basin of dirty dishes would say vulgar sexual things to me about women, real and imaginary. He trafficked in nonstop dirty talk, so I didn't take it personally, disgusting as it was. "Eric, you have girlfriend?" he would ask, leering like a satire. "You have girlfriend?" Actually, I didn't have girlfriend, but to get him off my back, I said that I did. Of course, this only stoked the fire. Eric, your girlfriend, she give you something, eh?" On and on it went. One day, Manolis was in the process of asking me if I knew the priest's teenage daughter, and began effusing over her looks when the priest came in through the swinging doors and overheard it. But Manolis was a decent enough cook, so the priest only snapped at him, "Ela sarap re bubuna," which unfortunately I can't translate the sarap, but that's "come on, stupid idiot," roughly speaking. So don't ask me why, but when I think of the sort of unregenerate person whom I cannot imagine ever really changing, for some reason I think of him. Again, we're not going to read everything that there is. If you want to do that, get the book. It's actually quite good reading. He talks some more about Chuck Colson, and then he talks about David Berkowitz, infamous for the Son of Sam murders in New York in 1977. Years ago, had what anyone close to him describes as a deep and thorough conversion to Christian faith. So much so that he refuses to appear before his parole board, believing he doesn't deserve to be released for what he did. Again, this is a conversion that's not convenient. Another conversion we're talking about is the conversion of C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, whose writings after his conversion touched many millions of lives. Conversion is often thought of something that happens instantly, and it sometimes doesn't happen that way, but it sometimes does happen that way, but often doesn't. Even when it happens in a way that appears instant, there's often more to the process than meets the eye. Later in this chapter, I tell of my own experience of being transformed literally overnight, but I can also remember steps along the way to that night, steps that were crucial and were part of my having that overnight experience. So on the one hand, it happened overnight, and on the other hand, it took years. William Wilberforce described his own conversion as the Great Change, which I write about in my book, Amazing Grace. It consists of a period of almost 2 years in which Wilberforce continued to change, but he never references any particular moment when he crossed the line of conversion. For all we know, the line he was crossing was so wide that it took him 2 years to cross it. Who can really say? And that's something for discussion later. The conversion of C.S. Lewis is a bit like Wilberforce's, except for him, it doesn't look as much like a long process as a number of distinct steps. He writes about the culmination of it in his autobiographical memoir, Surprised by Joy. One day he got into the sidecar of his brother Warnie's motorcycle, and they took off for the Whipsnade Zoo. When he got into the sidecar, Lewis says he did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But when he got out of the sidecar at the zoo, he did. Yes, yes. At what point then in that 1.5-hour motorcycle journey did Lewis cross the fabled line from unbelief to belief? Or was the whole journey of 35 miles the crossing of that line? Or was this ride in the sidecar that day simply the final leg of a longer journey? Once again, it's impossible to say, although I think the last statement does kind of fit. Lewis himself certainly didn't know the answer. Lewis tells us in Surprised by Joy of how as a child he experienced a deep longing for something beyond himself. He uses the German word Sehnsucht. I'm butchering that, I'm sure. Sehnsucht or something. But translates it as the English word joy. By way of contrast, Lewis's mother died when he was 9. He had prayed hard for her recovery, but she had not recovered. The years that followed were not pleasant ones. The boarding schools to which his father sent him were awful. Then there was the terrible experience of being a soldier in the Great War. Lewis's time in the trenches amid the bombs and poison gas and carnage, and seeing his closest friend killed, only hardened his heart toward whatever it was for which he had longed as a child. He became a confirmed atheist. His memory of praying for his mother's healing, followed by her death, was enough to settle things in his mind. But Lewis's disinterest in the God of the Bible didn't close him off from the world of fairy tales and myths. He particularly enjoyed and even loved the Old Norse sagas. Something in him resonated with them, though he never asked just what it was, and he was sure they were just stories, that they had no bearing on the material world in which we all live. In Surprised by Joy, he writes, "On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless." Lewis loved poetry and myth so much that early on he hoped to become a poet. As a student at Oxford University, Lewis scored an almost unheard of triple first and afterward became an expert in medieval literature, teaching and writing at Oxford about such masterworks as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Spenser's Faerie Queene. While at Oxford, Lewis became friends with J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a devout Roman Catholic. In time, Lewis's atheism turned to a kind of theism, but it went no further than that. How this happened he hardly knew, but he had put it off its happening as long as he could. It was not something he had desired. In a letter to his friend Arthur Greeves, he said, "I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." But he still hasn't had the sidecar experience. There his faith remained until one night when he, Tolkien, and their mutual friend Hugo Dyson took one of their late-night walks on the long wooded path behind Magdalen College in Oxford. The name of this path is Addison's Walk, and it is still there just as it was more than 8 decades ago when they frequented it. On September 19, 1931, at 1 or 2 in the morning, they were walking on Addison's Walk when their conversation turned to the subject of myth. Tolkien suggested to Lewis that the story of Christ dying and then rising from the dead was indeed a myth, just as the stories of all those young gods who died and then rose from the dead were also myths. But he suggested to Lewis that the myth of Christ was also true. He suggested that it was the one time in history that a myth had actually happened. This was why he believed it, and he encouraged Lewis to think about this as well. 9 days after that walk with Tolkien and Dyson, on the sunny morning of September 28, Lewis and his elder brother Warnie had decided to take a trip to the Whipsnade Zoo. And we just went over what happened there. It was no conscious decision, and yet it happened. He knew that it did. "I have just passed on from believing in God," he wrote, "to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it." Who can say how such a thing happens? But the effect this had on Lewis over the years to come was profound and extraordinarily far-reaching. For one thing, after he came to faith, he began to articulate that faith in an endless spate of books that have been read by many millions around the globe. And also a radio series that became Mere Christianity. His books on apologetics, such as Mere Christianity, have awakened millions to the rationality of Christian faith, while his books of fiction and fantasy, such as the Chronicles of Narnia, have awakened people to the imaginative and mythical side of it. And now he gets to his own conversion. My own conversion, which I recount in this chapter, was not the classic kind of conversion, although I've come to think that there really is no such thing as a classic conversion. In my case, my conversion didn't make me feel especially grateful that Jesus had died for my sins. I didn't really feel any particular sense of repentance. I didn't think about what Jesus had done on the cross. I certainly believed in all these things and knew they were deeply important, but there was no deep sense of those things that led to my conversion, as many often describe. Some people would say I cannot have been converted if those things, which they insist upon, weren't ticked off on whatever mental form they use to determine who has experienced an actual conversion and who hasn't. But that's just not what I experienced, and there are innumerable instances of conversions that don't involve those feelings. Perhaps I already knew Jesus in some way, and perhaps this was just a big and important step of embracing him fully and wholly. Who knows? God knows. All I know is that in that dream, he revealed himself to me in a way that changed everything, and from then on I have had no doubt that he is exactly who he says he is, and that I wanted to give him my whole life. Paul's truly classic conversion on the fabled and proverbial road to Damascus was not one where he was delivered from a load of guilt and sin. Actually, I've come to think of conversion not as crossing a finish line, but as crossing the starting line. Only once we know God and invite him into our hearts can we begin to run the real race we were meant to run all along. And once that happens, all kinds of things begin to change in our lives. I've heard of many people who suddenly experienced a sudden lack of desire for something to which they were previously addicted. They are suddenly freed from a desire to do crack or heroin. It is clearly miraculous and what Christians call a deliverance. But others continue to struggle with addictions for many years or for the rest of their lives, despite a genuine commitment to God and a desire to be relieved of that addiction or that besetting sin, whatever it is. In my case, the only thing that seemed to change quickly was my attitude towards sex outside of marriage. I suddenly knew that I couldn't have any part in that any longer, despite a long-term relationship with someone I loved and I thought I would marry. I suddenly knew that it was incompatible with the new person I had become, and that to honor God, I had to give that up. But the miracle for me was that giving it up was suddenly second nature. I felt that God's holiness was much more important, and I wanted to be as close to him and to give him full reign in my life, so this was not difficult. I suddenly felt a desire to want to channel this towards marriage, but it was so powerful a change that I knew it really was miraculous. Why these miracles are so powerful. Some of the strongest evidence that genuine conversions are indeed genuine and therefore miraculous is that they often overwhelm the one who has been converted. We've all met people who couldn't shut up about their faith and who suddenly became insufferable, as though every single conversation has to be about God and the Bible. Sometimes it's merely annoying and evidence of something that God has little to do with, but in many cases it's evidence that that person has had an overwhelming transformative experience that they themselves can hardly make sense of. It's often been compared to falling in love. Sometimes head over heels in love is wont to make an idiot of him, someone head over heels in love is wont to make an idiot of himself or herself, gushing about the object of their love at every opportunity. Much of that has to do with a volcano of emotions they're hardly at liberty to stop from erupting. When someone finds God in a real and powerful way, the effect is often the same. They talk about God and just can't stop talking about him or thinking about him. I can speak from personal experience. I'm sure in the months and first years of my conversion, many of my friends and relatives thought I had flipped. And to some extent, I had flipped, depending on the meaning of the verb to flip. Practically speaking, as with any torrid love affair, it will eventually simmer down to a manageable boil. In my case, it really did take years. I eventually got much better at learning how to channel my faith and my zeal for God in a way that wasn't entirely and quickly off-putting. I'm not fooling myself into thinking it's still not off-putting at some times to some people, but I know I've made progress. I can remember having powerful feelings of love and empathy towards total strangers, a sense of God's love for them, and a desire to do anything I could to show them His love, to bless them, to help them. I was often hardest on those who were already in the Christian world but whom I felt were not as zealous as they could be in reaching those who didn't know God. As is typical, I was hardest on my own, my family, and my childhood church, the Greek Orthodox Church. I saw it as an institution that had essentially failed to prepare me for the wide world and for the secularism of that world. I remember having conversations with Father Peter Karloutsas, the wonderful Greek Orthodox priest at the church in which I grew up. But I don't doubt half of what I said came across as more judgmental towards him and the ancient Orthodox faith. And I'm sure after a few of these conversations, he decided just to give up on me for his own mental health. At least for a while. I'm sure it was fatiguing for him. I'm glad to say that after 15 years or so, we came to understand each other and have a love for each other. I remember about 3 years after my conversion, I woke up one Saturday morning and was just praying about the day ahead. I had no particular plans, and as I prayed, I felt God nudging me to drive out to Danbury to help out with the Greek festival. It was exhilarating working there, and as firm a proof of one's Hellenic bona fides as anything could be. A few hours into my time, I overheard some people talking about something controversial. As I continued listening, I gathered there was someone at the front of the church driveway handing out Christian tracts, someone who had nothing to do with the Greek Orthodox Church. Father Peter was nearby, and I heard him say in a clearly derisive tone that it was some, quote, born-again Christian, end quote. It stung a little bit to hear this because for all I knew, he had wanted me to hear it. But in a few minutes, it dawned on me that I ought to go over and see who this person was and what they were handing out. I walked the 30 or so yards down the church driveway to where the man was standing. He was Greek. Evidently, he thought it clever to come to the festival and tell his fellow Greeks about what he had found, about being born again and having a personal relationship with Jesus instead of a meaningless and nominal religion that consisted only of attending church. He desperately wanted to communicate that, and he thought this would be just the place to do it. In some ways, I found it funny, and secretly couldn't help cheering him on. How wonderful if all the people he was talking with would find out what he had found, and I had found. Then one of the members of the church parish council came out, a short man with a mustache. I'd seen men like this over the years. They had little patience for this sort of thing. "Go on and get out of here," he said to the man. "We got our own religion. Our religion is the oldest religion there is." Of course, Judaism, I guess, is older, but whatever. The man had no sense of what this other man had experienced, that this man had evidently found nothing in the Greek Orthodox Church but empty tradition, and now he had found the joy and the peace of a real relationship with God. I went back to the souvlaki booth, chuckling to myself. Later on, I drove to my parents' home. Around 6, we decided it was time to drive, I'll add back to give you the sense of what's omitted, to the festival. But in the hours since I had left, I'd been strangely haunted thinking about the man handing out tracts. For some reason, I kept thinking I knew him. I asked him a few questions about his work history, and within seconds, I had the unbelievable answer. It was Manolis, the short-order cook from the Hilltop Diner. He was profoundly changed. Christians often quote the scripture verse that says God makes us a new creature in Christ. And this man was the most vivid example of this that I've could have imagined. Of course, I asked him what had happened to him to account for the change, and he told me his wife had become a born-again Christian. At first, he had rejected it entirely, but over time, he came to see that her own conversion was genuine and positive, and he had eventually followed suit. From my point of view, that day and forevermore, it was nothing less than a miracle. Now, I'm going to quit there. We'll go into some more next week. But I find it interesting that Metaxas starts his series on miracles with conversion, rather than with healing or unusual occurrences that appear to obviously violate the accepted rules of science, what we sometimes call as miracles. The mind is not well understood by anybody, and a skeptic can write off conversion as a special power of the mind. However, perhaps Metaxas is right. Conversion is written off too superficially by skeptics. He notes that the Greek Orthodox Church is not always conducive to conversion experiences. It's probably fair to note that conversion does not prove doctrinal orthodoxy, nor for that matter do other miracles. And there are some legends about miracles that probably should be debunked. One of them is that miracles can't happen. Yes, they can. Another one is miracles must be all from God, and that's not necessarily true. But a third one I think is interesting, that miracles do not guarantee correct theology. And if one doubts this, one may recall the experiences of the disciples who were miracle workers, bona fide miracles, and yet whose theology was definitely not correct at the time. They still thought Jesus would set up an earthly kingdom in their own personal lifetimes. I think that one thing is true, and that is that miracles do point beyond nature, and that, of course, makes them anathema now because although that's a relatively simple conclusion, it doesn't really say enough else about miracles. In this age, it is a profound conclusion. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn.
What are the criteria we can use to distinguish between a miracle, such the miracle that he has described here, and the conversion of a person to terrorism?
To terrorism.
There obviously there's good and bad here involved, and so on. Is that the difference? The experience he's describing here seems to be a relationship with God, which I don't think fits the terrorism scenario.
Well, certainly
although they claim it, and they very much speak about it when they perform some of their acts.
At least from what I have read, terrorists don't generally claim that they have suddenly learned to love the whole world. That's not part of the usual experience. It is usually, maybe they find their new profound respect for what they perceive as God, but it doesn't carry over into the loving your neighbor part. Although I guess one could claim that that's not part of Christianity, and so therefore it shouldn't be expected. And And one of the reasons that I say it's kind of unusual, I mean, he starts out with conversion, and yet if there are other kinds of conversion, then if one is a skeptic, one can write it off as, well, this is just another power of the mind that we don't really understand very well, and try to operate within a naturalistic framework anyway, because, well, the mind is part of nature, and therefore, it has powers that we don't understand. Well, give us time and we will. And we'll be able to use this kind of thing for humanistic type purposes. Maybe one could get converted to humanism. You do read about people who change their mind from Christianity and become evolutionists, for example, and feel that carries a whole set of belief systems with it. I'm thinking particularly of Will Provine, but Michael Shermer used to be a born-again Christian, at least according to his description of it. So that's why I say if your object is to destroy the pull of naturalism on people, I'm not sure that this is where I would have started. On the other hand, I'm not sure that that's where Metaxas is going with this, that he's not trying specifically to destroy naturalism as he is trying to give people a picture of something else first.
I gain a certain amount of comfort in the fact that naturalism forces me into believing in miracles. I'm sorry, but just talk about the fine-tuned universe, the original life, and the phenomenon of mind. I'm absolutely forced into this.
Not only that, but the phenomena of paraconformities and soft sediment deformation forces you to believe in kind of geological miracles as well.
Just want to clarify about conversion being a miracle. I definitely believe it's a miracle. And Ellen White, I wish I could lay my hands on the exact statement, but I know she says that the greatest miracle is a changed life. And of course she was speaking of one who gives his heart to God.
Right.
And submits.
And the greatest evidence for Christianity is a loving and lovable Christian.
And on the concept of conversion, of course, in the broadest sense of the term, conversion means change, radical. I guess I don't know if it has to be very radical, but I just thought of where I think it's somewhere in Great Controversy where Ellen White says even Satan is converted after a certain order when he comes and pretends to be Christ or an angel of light and is working miracles. He makes people sick and then he heals them and that sort of thing. So, I mean, just throwing that out for interest's sake.
Information has impact all of its own. We are well aware of information systems having bugs. What we're not as aware of is that the information itself has impact on information systems. Truth transforms. Information comes at a price, and the more we understand it, the more we are able to see. Things become clearer. That's why in many circles information is referred to as intelligence. Of course, this usually refers to correct, truthful information. If it is false, then we call it disinformation. Disinformation also has impact, in the sense that we tend to believe it to be true, not knowing that disinformation is in fact disinformation makes it that much more potent. And the big issue for us is being able to tell the difference between truth and falsehood. In fact, that is perhaps the crux of the spiritual battle. And some people feel, when they've discovered a interesting way of thinking about things, as if they've discovered America. Wow! This really puts things in a different setting, doesn't it? Must be true. Many things put things in a different setting even without having anything to do with truth. We have to recognize the fact that genuine information always comes at a price, and we have to apply due diligence to test and see whether this information that we are taking on is in fact credible, is truthful, is likely dependable or not. Now you can see somebody who has had a lot of trouble with Christians, and sometimes the saints are more difficult to get along with than the sinners. You can see how such a person will find a different way of looking at things suddenly very appealing.
It sounds like Eric Metaxas had some of that himself.
Well, there you go. And vice versa. This is what explains why we have pendulum swings in our societies. It seems like we go through periods of either pulling to the right or pulling to the left. And it seems that each new generation thinks that they've discovered America with a new way of thinking. Guess what? All it is a pendulum swing. Now, when you have this swinging between alternatives, what does that tell you? That tells you that people do not see. That's why we're swinging from one extreme to the other. We do not understand what we're talking about. And unfortunately, speaking with a great deal of confidence, when we do not see, is just adding to the disinformation.
We have a comment back there.
Well, one has to be careful because the devil must be a gentleman, whereas victims wouldn't like him.
I don't know, one of the things that I've kind of wrestled with, we have a comment down here if you want to pass the mic over, is, you know, we're going to run into people who, even though theologically we understand that there are people who are not Adventists who have genuine Christian experiences, it's sometimes easy to get closed up into our own little world and forget that, and then become surprised when we run into stories like this. And, you know, and also to wrestle with the difficulty of when God does intervene in such cases, does that bless the theological understanding of the people whom he runs into? And I think the discomfort with that question can lead us to discount the experiences themselves, which I regard as not necessarily a good thing. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, Christianity does today, and Adventism in particular, does not really attract the secular person because we many times are so focused so much on trying to prove something that we forget what it means. So the secular person is not attracted to it. Now, could God take that secular person and convert them into something like Buddhism or something like that, and they also have a very changed life and become more loving? Does God ever do that?
It's an interesting question.
Can't see how we convert someone to Buddhism who doesn't even believe in it. Buddhist denies Buddhism denies God.
It's a changed life.
Well,
nevertheless.
it's particularly interesting because although a lot of Christians will draw a line around Christianity, and in fact, Ralph Martin's book, The Four Cults, was specifically designed with that in mind. And in case if you're wondering, the four cults, I think, were Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and I'm trying to remember what the other two, and I know that Adventism, what?
Christian Science.
Christian Science, and there was one more because there's four of them.
Seventh-day Adventists.
Actually, no, Seventh-day Adventists escaped from being a cult.
In the original book.
In the original,
That's
it was
before
Adventist.
1906.
Yeah. What struck me as interesting is as I read the book further on, I discovered that Ralph Martin said that the biggest cult in Christianity is Catholicism, because they have an extra biblical source of authority. They have a structure that, and they claim that which Catholicism did for a long time, claim that they're the only true church, which interestingly enough, Orthodox Christianity was kind of prevented from doing because there were a number of other, there's Greek Orthodox and there's Russian Orthodox and there's the Syrian Church and there's Maronites and there's all kinds of other groups that the Orthodox recognize as being truly Christian, whereas Roman Catholicism managed to write all of them off. So Ralph Martin was making this case that Christianity was, that Catholicism was in fact a cult, a non-Christian cult. And when I realized that and looked at all of the criteria that he was using, I realized that in fact, what Ralph Martin was trying to do was turn Christianity into a cult. You couldn't be saved outside of Christianity. And the reason that it was important to name all the other cults is because that way he could exclude them from Christianity, which was the true religion that you had to be saved inside of. And the question is Christianity a cult? If so, how did people become saved before Jesus came? And I'll throw you just one little counterexample to that. You'll remember the Pharisee and the publican are up. Pharisee is saying, I do all these wonderful things, and the publican is saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, and he won't even lift his eyes up. And Jesus said, that man went home justified instead of the other. You know, the dikaio, the word that we always argue over whether it's justification and righteousness, does it include sanctification, all that kind of stuff in Paul. And Jesus, he flat out says the guy's justified by doing only two things. One, confessing I am a sinner, and two, I need a higher power. Which, interestingly enough, are the first two steps of the 12-step program. Go ahead.
You also have the example of the other man on the other cross next to Christ.
Yeah, although he was saying that to Jesus, so you could kind of call him a Christian if you wanted to.
About the question about would God lead someone to become a Buddhist? Was that the statement? I can't see how he could do that, would do that, but he is trying to reach every soul who hasn't committed the unpardonable sin, and you have to do a lot to get there, I think.
Which means that he has to operate outside of official Christianity some of the time.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. People will check out, I want to check out this and maybe that, and and the devil's working too. He's trying to get you off the track. But God is always there, speaking with the still small voice, trying to reach people. And if they will keep listening, they'll see circumstances. It may be circumstances. It may be something they read, and it may be someone they meet will steer them in the right direction, away from some of these wonderful sounding philosophies that are destructive, till they eventually will come into the truth. I've read people's experience, and I think I won't cite anyone because I don't know if I'll remember all the details, but anyway, I know I've read of people going through that kind of experience and coming to the truth eventually.
Okay. A comment here, and then there, and then there. Okay.
Everybody has steps towards God. Nobody makes a giant leap, be like jumping to the moon. So however people get there in all their different ways, and who can say one's right or wrong? Maybe they're all wrong because they don't make that leap right away, but that's human nature and that's the human condition. But just a little correction, Buddhism does believe in God, they just don't call it God. I hear many things all the time about different religions that people don't know about it, and they've heard from other Christians that didn't know about it. Maybe that's the case, but anyways, they do. In fact, several scriptures they mirror several scriptures, and a good Buddhist will be better at some of those things that Christianity teaches is the law, and very few Christians. It'd be hard for any Christians to beat them because they have a different way of approaching it. But I would say, a good Buddhist will be a better Christian than 90% of the Christians, but that's from my experience. But anyways.
Well, of course, according to Jesus, that may be a low bar, but...
yeah, perhaps.
There are many definitions of conversion, many definitions of miracle in relation to conversion. I'd like to suggest that the impossible becomes the possible, just stated very simply. Things that are stacked up, the odds are totally against a person changing. I mean, just totally against. And that's where the power of the personal testimony is one of the most powerful arguments for Christianity. And right from the New Testament, you are my witnesses. A witness is someone who observes, someone who has followed progress of another person's life, not just a one-time flash, but someone who is almost walking some of the same pathway, but that other person is going a totally different direction.
Or sometimes a person who's witnessing about his own experience.
Very good. In Adventism, we have some of the most remarkable conversion stories, Doug Batchelor, the caveman, the richest caveman, that happened right here in California. The odds were stacked against him converting to Christianity, first of all, and to Adventism, because here he is, shabbily dressed, long hair, hippie lifestyle. he walks into the sophisticated Palm Springs Seventh-day Adventist church, and they just throw their arms around him. I mean, this is this is kind of unheard of. We have other adult conversion stories. Clifford Goldstein, intellectually, he was atheist. And a lot of times it takes a C.S. Lewis type of conversion where you're wrestling with the magnitude of belief and rationalism and Christianity. And I could tell a lot of stories. I won't tell you my own, but when I was a pastor, probably one of the most remarkable stories was to see a 75-year-old man change after 40-some years, almost 50 years, married to an Adventist. I think it was 50 years. And he loved his drink. I would go and visit him as his wife's pastor. He was not a member. And he would boast about how he was from Kentucky and they had their moonshine during Prohibition, and he knew the art of making it. And I just knew that was his life, see. Late in life, I think the Lord was working on him through his wife, because she kept inviting him, come to church when they come to church. And he did come, and he heard some of my sermons, but it wasn't my sermons that would make a change in his life. He was just, most people would give up on someone like that. Brother Yother was his name. But his wife told me how she started seeing one remarkable change after another. One of the most remarkable is to see him kneeling by his bedside praying for the first time. She had just never seen that in 50 years. And then I went. He wanted Bible studies. I went. He was baptized. He told me how he made the last change was to break the alcohol habit. Now here's how he did it. He had one bottle left, so he said, I'm going to drink this one. I'm going to walk out to the trash pile. I'm going to throw it. I'm going to shatter the bottle, and that's it. And he never went back to it. Now, to me, that's a miracle because, the rate of falling into the trap is very high. So I believe in
Recidivism
miracles.
for alcoholics, yeah.
Yeah, with alcoholics.
While he was being converted, he did have one last drink.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend, if he had come to me and asked, how should I do it? I'd say, give up right now.
Yeah, the joke is the difference between an alcoholic and a reforming alcoholic is that the next drink is the last, and the other one is the last drink was the last.
I also think about Stephen Holberg. Right. Think about Emilio Kenneckley. Some of you know that name. Think about Walter White. Yes, there have been quite a few who have touched my life. We were talking about Gautama Buddha and Buddhism. You see, Buddhism teaches through karma, Sanskrit word, through your work, you attain nirvana, become a god. Well, that's if that were true, then all the Pharisees would be the first ones to be in heaven. That's not quite so. We talked about the pendulum earlier, and the beautiful text in Psalms 85:10, mercy and truth have met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. This happened at the cross. So in a Christian's life, there is no pendulum, where at the cross, righteousness and peace have met. Talk about legalist and someone who is liberated in Christ. Someone is driving through the neighborhood. The liberated one knows that we are to slow down. So it does not look at the odometer. Well, we're going at 34, maybe even at 36, but knows that we are in the neighborhood where to go slowly. Whereas the legalist is sitting there. We go at 35. And 35, you see, from looking from outside, someone might think, oh, you're a legalist. That's why the Lord says you're going to be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Matthew 22, verse 10. Because from looking from outside, there's no difference. The people say, you Seventh-day Adventists, you guys are legalists. Well, that's the perception. However, there might be people who are also liberated in Christ who are keeping this. Sabbath is a day of delight and not being a legalist. You have been talking about miracle, if I could make one last point. Know that name, Charles Krauthammer? He was a med student first year, dove in the swimming pool. Hit his head, just the right angle, the right amount of force, severed his spinal cord. And people don't realize, but he's wheelchair bound. He was the other day I heard him speak, and he was talking about near-death experience. So, in the surgery and places, people say, I saw myself coming out, going through the tunnel, saw this great light, the angels are coming for me, suddenly I'm back on the table. But he says, yes, he knew that this was it. He did not see a tunnel, he did not see the bright light. He knew that this was it, and he was prepared. Satan will come with saying, yes, here is your near-death experience, you're going to heaven. And the whole movies are now based on this thing. Yes, God is with us. We have to be so very careful about who we listen to. So when I heard him speak, I thought about these Christians basing their whole faith in something that has nothing to do with Christianity.
We have a comment in the back there, and then
this is just a little play on words, but
we'll finish.
one last drink becomes one more last drink, ad infinitum, lasts forever.
Go ahead, Doug. And maybe since we'll have one more comment after Doug, and then we'll call it a day, I think.
So in public health, we do like a community needs assessment, and we go ahead and identify something about the community that needs improvement, maybe smoking cessation, maybe teen pregnancy, these sorts of things. And then we design a program and have an objectively verifiable indicator that we can follow to see how is our program going, and do evaluation and make modifications and seeking to improve the public health statistics on that condition. But it's interesting that when it comes to health behavior change, you can have a fella who doesn't, maybe he, loves his alcohol, loves his cigarettes, sedentary lifestyle, carouses, high-risk behavior, 1 month, and then a month later is changed in all of those, and the difference is because he received in the mail a flyer with all these strange beasts of Revelation, and he's curious, and so he goes and learns about the Bible and has a change, and then that affects all of those health behaviors, not just one. Sort of an interesting approach to health behavior change, the conversion process. And I've sort of wondered what would a Christian approach to public health be that might look at conversion as a form of health behavior change.
Well, if it's something that we can bring about, that would be one thing. If it's a miracle that God does when He wants, then it may be a little more difficult to package. One more comment, and I think we'll call it a day.
I like Warren Johns' definition of a miracle. It's something that you can't explain easily. And I think conversion is one of those things. We need to keep in mind that the Bible tells us the devil performs miracles also. So it's not an absolute criterion. I like throwing a criterion of goodness involved when it's a miracle performed by God. which
That eliminates the terrorist.
it eliminates the terrorist problem question of miracles. Truth ought to make more sense than error, and I think considering the evaluation of goodness added to it and so on, we can get a picture here of miracles. But keep in mind, the devil can perform miracles also.
Well, with that, I invite you to come back next week and we'll have some more discussion of miracles, including a little bit more on conversion experiences. So, welcome back next week.